Welcome tonight to this event by the Menard Family, George Washington at Ohio University. Thanks for tuning in. You'll have a chance after and during the event tonight to ask questions of tonight's guest. If you look below in the Zoom webinar, there's a Q&A function. Feel free to ask your question and we'll pose it to Zena Hitz. Our guest tonight is Zena Hitz. She's a tutor at St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. She was an undergraduate at St. John's before going off to Cambridge, Chicago, and finally Princeton for graduate degrees in philosophy. She teaches there now, but before returning to St. John's in 2015, she taught at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, Auburn, McGill. Plus, she spent a few years in the remote Ontario woods away from universities, learning to love learning again. And her most recent book, part of which deals with that, is Lost in Thought, The Hidden Pleasures of an Intellectual Life. We'll be talking about that tonight. Thanks for joining us, Zena. Appreciate you being here.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So I take this book to be about what it is to be a full human being, and the intellectual life as a sort of path to be a full human being. It deals with universities and the kind of problems that many see facing them today, but it's about a lot more.
I think for me, the thing that I have received, for which I'm very grateful, which I would tell any young person to cultivate, is I read a lot when I was younger, and I learned to really enjoy it. And I learned some habits of patience. That is, I know for a fact from my own experience that when you sit with a difficult book, even if it's driving you crazy, the words are swimming on the page, you can't make any sense of it. If you sit with it and find someone to talk to about it, you will learn something. So I think that's what experience and habits can teach you and what you can cultivate when you're young. And that way, no matter how chaotic and undisciplined your life is and how undisciplined you are by nature, you know that that thing that you're reaching for is really worth it. And that's the space that you want to get to. You want to have that deep motivation to do it because you know from your own experience that it's worthwhile. You know those satisfactions of learning. And that's, I think, really that is the secret, and everything else is secondary. It's learning to love and to enjoy this stuff, which just takes practice and time and help. You need help from others.
Like, what do you do at St. John's?
Well, so we have an all-required curriculum based on great books. We have a 4-year seminar series starting with the ancient Greeks and going up into the 20th century of literature and philosophy and political theory. We have a mathematics program where we read classics of mathematics, starting with Euclid, going up through Newton and Einstein. We have music and science and languages also worked in there. So it's the kind of thing which, if you were coming at it from a cultural literacy point of view, you might look at it and say, oh yes, that's just what we're looking for. It's all the classics, it's the Western heritage. But I don't think of it that way. And I don't actually think many of my colleagues think of it that way either. It's a very profound encounter with very rich books which ask fundamental questions, which I think are in the heart of every human being. They're in what's interesting, what we call the Western tradition, which is really a much more complicated thing than that. It's a lot of different traditions tied together one way or another. It's a bunch of books that talk about each other. And you have those in other civilizations, other forms of culture. You have traditions where there's books talking to one another. And that's what we have. It allows for a certain depth to your education, a certain breadth to read over some centuries, a variety of reflections, where you can see one of the reasons I object to cultural literacy is a human being, the author of a great book, and any of us, is a creative, active being. We don't just read and take in like we're downloading a PDF, into our hardware. We respond, we react, we digest what we read, and we remake it in some way in our own time and place and according to our own character. That's what you see when you study the traditions, and that's what you see when you that's what you really need to do when you read these books is become alive, develop your mind in your desires in such a way that you are thinking and understanding the things that really matter to human beings. So it's a much more process focused than content, but I do think the content is important. That is fundamental questions that matter to every human being. That's important as content. But cultural literacy, I think, is much too narrow and really doesn't provide the kind of education that I would want to provide for my students.
Yeah. So it was there in that answer that you just gave, or the bit that you just talked about there. You said, it's human questions, and one of the things that's notable about your book is you think that human beings are human beings are human beings, right? That there are deep commonalities across cultures, races, sexes of what a human being is, and the entire first part of your book is about you say that we all have, or we should have, what you call a single basic orientation in our lives, and you use words like ultimate value, natural need, desires, all the stuff taken out of Aristotle. I just wonder if you could, this will be foreign to lots of people listening to this. What is a single basic orientation? What is a natural need? What is a right and a wrong desire?
Well, let's start with the big one, namely, what's an ultimate end? What if, and it's, by the way, not something which I think we ought to have, but something which I think we do have, as a matter of fact. There just is something that everyone on this call, and me, we all care about more than anything. You don't know what it is necessarily, because if you were to ask yourself, what do I care about most? You'd say, oh, well, my family and learning and, being comfortable and my church and, my football team and what have you. You might say all kinds of things. But when the chips were down, if you were in a crisis, there's one of those things that you would pick over another if they came into conflict. So that's the idea of an ultimate end. There's something in which you think your happiness really lies, the meaning of your life really lies. And that's the thing which, when the chips were down, you would choose over something else. So, but it doesn't have to be something good. You might hope it was your family, or you might hope it was, mathematical truth, or all kinds of, or justice, or all kinds of things, the love of God. But it might turn out to be protecting your reputation, or making a little more money, or things like that. And it's not that necessarily it's bad to want money or it's bad to protect your reputation, but you don't want that to be driving the bus of your life. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where you sacrifice your family to protect your reputation. You sacrifice truth to make an extra buck. That's not what you want to do. So that's the kind of framework that I'm working with, is that our desires have a kind of order, they have a hierarchy, and you want to think about what it is, because you don't want to find out at the wrong moment that your priorities were in the wrong order.
How would you know what how would you know, I just linger that on that a sec. How would you judge what a hierarchy of needs or goods or ends are, right? I mean, you mentioned hierarchy of goods. How would you distinguish between them, or what are ways to thinking about what's near the top and the bottom of that totem pole?
So the classic distinction, which is crucial, it's not everything, but it's important, is things that are good for the sake of something else, instrumental goods, means to ends, and things which really matter in their own right. So, money is a good thing. Why is it good? Well, it's good because it provides for comfort, it provides stability, it can get you an education and your children an education. It can get you a nice place to live. It can get you all kinds of things which are good, food to eat, food on the table. But if money becomes just an end in itself, where all you're doing is watching the numbers go up, and it's sucking energy away from things that matter more to you, then that's not good. So that's an instrumental good. Money, social status too. You can use social status for good, but if all you're doing is climbing the ladder, it's not good. So then there are things which matter for their own sake. Okay, they matter. These are activities which time drops away. All you care about is what you're doing in that moment. Might be sitting with your family, just having a good time. It might be something darker than that. You're at the hospital bed with someone that you really care about, and that's all you've got right there. But it matters for its own sake that you're there. You're not there for any other reason than for love. Going to church, and thinking, creating, imagining, the arts and the sciences, and reading and studying, these things also matter for their own sake. So that's the basic distinction I want to make. Things which are leisured and have their goodness all packed into them, and things which are good because you want something else out of them.
Yeah, one of the things, maybe another way of rephrasing that, when you read your book, the things you find good are things that drag you outside of yourself, and the things that you find less good are things that focus you purely on yourself. Is that a fair enough way of? It
is, only it gets complicated because there's a way in which thought and reflection are inward. So there's ways of looking at yourself that are wholesome and good and deepen your experience and give you a core in life. And there are ways of looking at yourself that are not good, that are self-involved, that are at the surface, are selfish in a bad way.
Yeah, right. So clarify that. The intellectual life is something that drags you inward in the Hitz reading in order to let you have a deeper communion with others and with the world around you, right? So that's the one, that would be the exception to the Hitz rule, as I take it. All right, so
fair enough.
You love learning, not because you want to do a kind of cultural literacy thing. This is not just a warmed over version of that. And you have you sort of come at it first from thinking, what is a human being? And you have in your word a kind of hierarchy of ends, and the ones that kind of drag you outside of yourself, looking outside of yourself, are better than ones that are purely self-focused, with the possible exception of the intellectual life. So can we talk intellectual life, the way that you describe it? You talk a lot about inwardness and withdrawal. What is inwardness and withdrawal? Like, how does education, or how does the intellectual life, not education, right? I think you distinguish between those, but how does the intellectual life help us be inward? And what is it to be inward? Why do you want to withdraw from the world? That's not a good thing, is it?
Well, I mean something very specific by withdrawal from the world or by going inward. And it's almost just a negative idea. So if you think about, your vision of yourself when you walk into the high school cafeteria, and there's the table of cool kids, and there's the table of the jocks, and there's the table of the nerds, and there's the table of the cheerleaders, and there's the table of the and there's a little ranking, which table is which. That's the world one way or another. And we may have graduated from high school, but many of us still live in our imaginations in that world. We're seeing ourselves as we are ranked by our social environment. And we may be trying to climb it. We may be just trying to survive and avoid humiliation, but somehow that's telling us who we are. And even if we're the winners, I mean, I like the stories of the losers, the people at the bottom of the barrel who retreat from that world of judgment and find their own dignity in reading and thinking and studying and writing poetry, what have you. But it's true, even if you're the winner, that's not really where your value as a human being comes from. It doesn't come from being on the top of a social ranking. It comes from who you are, independent of all that. So the point of withdrawal and the point of retreat and inwardness is to get away from that social ranking system and into things which you really care about and which give you a certain amount of dignity or worth in and of yourself. Give you a kind of space of retreat where you can reflect, where you can think about things, where you can ask yourself how you want to act in the world that's around you. I think that's familiar to most people. I don't think it's a crazy out there idea, but I do think it's fundamental to intellectual life.
What's wrong about that? I mean, that you may intuitively, so it sounds like a stupid question, but what's wrong with being dominated by your senses? It's natural, right? I mean, what's not, right? And how, maybe it's a technique for students. How can, what are ways your students face the same things that we all do? How do they do it? How do you help them?
Yeah.
Pay attention.
It's hard. So the first thing, what's wrong with it? I mean, there's a simple thing to say, which is, your attention is limited. You're not going to have, it may feel that way, especially when you're younger, that you can you can take up your attention with all kinds of stuff that doesn't really matter and you're not losing anything. But in fact, your time on earth is limited and the amount of attention you have to offer anything in a given day is limited. So you have to make some choices. And you don't want to spend all of your attention on things that you actually don't really care about. And I'm not afraid to just appeal to people's experience, because I think I think everyone I know, when they spend the whole day on Twitter, the whole day playing video games, don't feel very good afterwards. You don't feel like you do if you've maybe done a little bit just to distract yourself, but you've also put in some work that really mattered to you. So I'm happy just to appeal to people's experience that there are things which are fulfilling, deeply fulfilling. There are things which you never forget having done and you never regret having done. And then there are things which are, maybe not a bad way to unwind, but you don't want to be spending your life doing that. So it's that simple. As far as techniques, I don't have any secrets. You have to know, apart from the thing I said at the beginning, you have to convince yourself the same way that you might be convinced about the value of music from having practiced, or the value of sports for having practiced. You have to convince yourself that thinking is going to be worth what you put into it. And that's what you should be spending your time in college doing, is convincing yourself of that, just like you have with whatever else that you're interested in, music or sports or your relationships or whatever that is. Just convince yourself that it's worth some suffering. And when you've done that, then you'll have some leverage against all the things that are distracting you.
Okay. So the intellectual life is, joke it's about asceticism, but a positive way to do it is it's about mastering yourself. It's not being subject to someone else's whims. It's being able to control yourself. Self-control they used to have on the old-fashioned report cards. I didn't get good marks for those. Okay, so you've learned, you're a student, you're working in an insurance office. One of your things about the intellectual life is it's open to anyone, and it should be pursued by everyone in some form or another. So you've made that step of mastery. You've convinced yourself that that it's worth in either a concerted stretch of the day or even just a sort of short burst of the day to master yourself and to throw yourself at the problem of the intellectual life. One of the things you say is it's not about content, it's about a direction, right? So that's back to that thing. It's not the original, it's not the old liberal arts education, the kind of cultural literacy deal. It's about a direction. And one of the things you say, now I just want you to talk about that actually the intellectual life helps you see the world, helps you face the world as it is. That's an unusual thing, right? You know, one of the things that the most common things that any academic gets, and certainly since, well, you know, you've got book learning, but you don't know about the real world. And your argument seems to be that actually the intellectual life properly pursued actually helps you stare at the ugly realities of the world. Honestly, I just wonder why you think that's the case. I mean, what are examples of that you can think of or that you would use?
That's a great question. One example is any intellectual endeavor that's worthwhile is going to involve an encounter with some reality, some limitation. So you're trying to do some math problem and you just can't do it. And then finally, maybe it clicks at the last possible minute, or maybe it clicks after the exam, which is the worst part, right? Or, you know, you're reading a novel and love this character and just something terrible happens to them, or they do something terrible, and it's just the crunch of reality. So part of it is getting into the habit and even starting to enjoy that discovering of one's limitations, the discovering of that feeling of what it's like to see something for what it is. I also think, though, there's a much more concrete way that already connects to things we've been talking about, which is, you know, it's what's the real world that people are plugging into now? You know, a lot of it is a news cycle or a social media world or the NFL season or all kinds of things. Are these the real world? I think they're not. They're stories that are interesting, entertaining, maybe even useful, sometimes true. You can learn something from them, but they're not what's really going on. What's really going on is what's right in front of you. So one of the things going to happen when you read, say, old books, which is what I normally do, that's my favorite form of intellectual life, is you tell yourself a bunch of other stories. You learn about a lot of other places and times that are very different from the one that you live in. And that can help you to see the difference between the truth and a lie in what's around you. That's one thing. The other thing is, I think if you detach from the social competition, from the high school cafeteria world, if you accustom yourself to a different level of being, a different way of relating to the world, then I think you are just more likely to see what's really in front of you. You're more likely to see, instead of seeing the hierarchy of the cafeteria, you know, you see the lonely kid in the back that no one's talking to. And you think, oh, well, maybe I'll talk to that kid. So I don't want to idealize it. I don't want to say that somehow intellectual life makes you into a saint. It might and it might not, but it gives you the resources to encounter reality if you really give yourself to it, if you take advantage of those.
So this is the part where you've struck a chord with some of the viewers tonight. So some questions are rolling in. I'll take a break from mine and sort of pose some of them to you. So one question is, you've talked about the need for a kind of withdrawal from the world in order to lead an intellectual life. And the questioner asks, aren't friends useful for, among other things, learning? Is there a tension between friendship and that withdrawal?
Well, see, the answer is no. I'm happy to say. So, and thank you for asking that, because I think it's something I had in my mind to say when we've been asking about what helps you to learn, what helps you to break free of your online compulsions. And the simplest answer to that is a bit of community, some friends, some fellow travelers, some comrades, people who you can get together with and share certain activities with, just like anything else. So the trick is, right, that you need real friends who are committed to something that you care about. And especially when you're young, it's hard to form friendships which are for real in that way, and that aren't just a way of jockeying position in the cafeteria again. So but I don't want to be too cavalier about that, because I'm speaking for myself personally. It took a lot of work to figure out who was a real friend and who was someone who I felt like I needed to survive in the social world. But anyway, companions, people to help you, people to encourage you, that's crucial. That's the piece of advice I gave everyone who asks me, how can I do this? It's find a friend.
Withdraw, but don't do it alone. Another one of the listeners asks a good question. Is like, all right, let's get into the content, right, of what some of this stuff looks like. So we talked about, what habits of mind you need to have, what is the purpose. Let's talk about some of the content. And the person says, there are so many old books. Where do you start, right? I mean, this is a way I thought of, what three books do you recommend? People listening to this, students, non-students, whoever, what should they read? Start reading.
Well, I despite the fact that I teach at a program that's quite regimented, there's an order, it takes 4 years, there's a beginning and there's a middle and there's an ending. The truth is, depending on what you're doing and what your plans are for your life, there may not be any single right answer as to where you start. And it might be something as simple as you've got a couple of friends and you can all agree on reading Dostoevsky or reading Immanuel Kant or whatever it is. For me, if other things being equal, I say start with something ancient Greek. So you've got these wonderful epic poems, Homer, the Iliad, and Homer's Odyssey. This is the television of 800 BC. It's beautiful stories, it's gripping, it's beautiful. It takes a little bit of effort to get in, so find a friend to read it with, but very enjoyable. Plato, Dialogues of Plato. It's philosophy, but it's written as a drama. You have this incredible character, Socrates, who was a historical figure. You can get a sense of who he was and who his friends were from these books. So those are some examples of things that I might start with, other things being equal. But I think it's hard enough to do, and it's rare enough, frankly, nowadays, that if something appears to you like that's particularly interesting, Augustine's Confessions or Dante or whatever happens to come across you, something Roman, if you're interested in ancient war and empire and stuff like that, go ahead and read that. Find a friend and read it, and see where it takes you.
You can see where this is going, right? The questions are rolling in now. Now people are, the question somebody asked, okay, what's your advice on the first steps to live an intellectual life? Right, just generically, it doesn't matter if you're a student or not, but that's the attendee's question. What do you do? Just start reading? What do you suggest?
So there is many ways of living an intellectual life as there are ways of being a human being. Okay. And I'm not saying that to avoid the question. I'm saying that because it's not, again, it's not rigid. So for me, it's reading. So you can pick up books and read them. But you know, some people are really interested in mathematics. They do it for fun. That's intellectual life. So find a way to do some mathematics for its own sake, not for a class, you know, not for a degree, but just something that you think would be interesting and fun to play around with some friends. Bird watching, that's an intellectual activity, very time-honored activity. Get to know different types of birds, find out about their lives, their habits, where they fly, when. So each person, or, you know, you might be quite religious, and there's forms of intellectual life which are appropriate for religious people, studying scripture, studying the history of the church, all of these things. There's something most likely that each of you cares about that's the tip of an iceberg of some piece of learning. And just do that learning regardless of whether you know what's going to come of it. So many young people and older people too are so regimented. Everything's got to count for something. And part of what I'm encouraging you to do is to try to get that mentality to one side and think about what kind of life you want to lead and how you want to be spending your time and what's going to really make you feel like a full human being.
There's one thing you clearly think doesn't, right? So you have this sort of related question coming out. You say, oh, you cannot lead an intellectual life if you are super into politics, right? If you think politics really is deeply important, that is at odds with the intellectual life. That will many serious students and many serious people care lots about politics, and they read books, right? And so here we have Hitz rolling in from Annapolis saying, no. Politics, you know, it undermines the intellectual life. How does it?
Well, I think the way you put it is a little stronger than the way I would have ever put it.
Maybe intentionally.
Politics, insofar as it's a struggle for power, is not an intellectual activity. Okay, it's a pragmatic activity. You know, the same way that, you know, if you're running a business and you're trying to get market share, you know, you may be using your mind. I'm not saying it's mindless, but you're not thinking, you're not reflecting and contemplating on things for their own sake. You're trying to do something. You're trying to get something. So that's the thing that isn't, on the one hand, that is not intellectual life. And I think it can be confused with that. And I think that's bad. I think it's one of the things that you want to step back from is the struggle for power, even when that power is something that you mean to use for something that's good and worthy. That's one thing. The second thing is, I think intellectual life has to be open-ended. That is, you don't, if you're really asking yourself a question, you don't know the answers. So a lot of times what happens when political life infects intellectual life in a way that I don't like, it's because someone's already decided what they think, and they're just looking for materials to bolster their arguments. That's kind of the debate mentality too, you know, which for fun is fine, but don't take it too seriously. You know the end position, so you're just looking for things that support the end, and you're not really learning. You're not opening yourself up to some piece of reality and asking yourself what it's. I'm not in any way denying that you can be interested in politics and think about things on the side. Just that they're different things, and they matter for different reasons. So
one of the questioners said, you know, ask about, you know, arrogance in intellectual life. Is the intellectual life, is it precious, right? Is it something you, Zena Hitz, can have, but plebs can't? You know, is this something that, I mean, it is, that relates to another question I want to ask you about something you said about Plato's Republic later on, but is this counsels of arrogance on your part?
So this is a question that has haunted me for many years. So I want to be careful about it because it matters to me. I think it can start out that way. I think for most people like myself who are in an intellectual line of work, we're kind of official, professional intellectuals, we're college professors, what have you. We often start out because we just need to feel superior to other people. You know, that's just you've got to do it. You fail at something else, like me, you're bad at sports, so you've got to be good at something, you know, and maybe it's school, maybe that's all you've got. So I don't think that that's really what intellectual life is about. It can get you in the door, but then you've got to leave it behind. Because in the end, I think every human being can think, reflect, contemplate, savor the world as it is. Everyone can have some contact with reality and can appreciate it. And, you know, it's degrees and walks of life and styles of reflection. Those things might all be different. But it's very important that it actually be a bond of unity between one human being and another, and not something that separates us out. That's really crucial for the way I think about it. But it was hard work. So
is fair to say one of the recurring themes in the book is that the intellectual life shows you not that you're special, but that you're ordinary, right? I mean, I think that's almost every example you have is about the intellectual life puncturing one's self-worth rather than inflating it.
The two examples are really brought in for a narrower question than you might have. So it connects to what you asked about earlier about arrogance, or one of the students asked about arrogance. You know, these are two, the protagonist of the Neapolitan novels and Augustine in his own description. These are competitive young people. They're smart and they want to get ahead and they want to get to the top, and they don't care what it costs them or anyone else. So that's what they do. So then the question I have is, well, how is it that you get out of a situation like this? You're an intelligent person. There's something in there that actually wants to learn and to encounter reality, encounter truth for its own sake, but it's trapped in this hyper-competitive mode of life, set of habits. How does it crack? So there's a story about Augustine. Okay, he gets into this intellectual cult. He sees some contradictions. It starts to break down. And then he doesn't know what to believe anymore. He, meets this guy Ambrose, who's a bishop who he likes a lot. He's attracted, but he still can't make himself quite believe. Then he's convinced intellectually, but he can't quite make himself live like a Christian. And then finally he has this, this moment where he collapses and turns around. Okay. So that's one kind of story of how someone, and he's still egotistical even after he's converted. You can tell from his writing, but he's pointed in a different direction. He's no longer trying to climb the hierarchy of Roman officials. He has a different kind of life in view. So in the Neapolitan novels, what I think happens is it's this friendship between these two women, which is a type of contemplative friendship. They think about the people who they live with. They tell stories about them. They imagine their lives. They're both authors. They tell stories, fictional stories. Sometimes it's a recasting of their own lives. Sometimes they're writing about each other. And their friendship, their concern for one another, and their creative work ends up getting the protagonist out of that highly competitive mode and into something that is lasting, is good, is real, is connected at least with a real friendship, a real concern for another human being. So it's to me a story for sure about how someone gets from something worse to something better. Whether there's something yet better beyond that, I think there is, but I wouldn't discourage someone from going part of the way if that was the way that intellectual life is. I don't think it's as much of a luxury as people think it is, but it is a bit more of a luxury, as you need to have a little bit of time, a little bit of mental space, need to not be totally exhausted in order to be able to carve that time out.
Well, thanks to you for carving out your time for us tonight. Thanks to everyone who is dialed in tonight for carving out your time.
Is that Mill argues there is an important distinction between two different kinds of pleasure, two different ways of thinking about happiness. On the one hand, there's the higher forms of pleasure. These are intellectual pleasures of the mind, things like art, literature, history, philosophy, and so forth. And then there are the lower sort of carnal pleasures. These are the physical pleasures based upon the body, experience of the body, right? These are things like food, sex, being lazy, laying around in the sun. These are the sorts of examples that Mill discusses regarding these two different ways of thinking about pleasure: the higher intellectual pleasures and the lower base or carnal pleasures. So the way that Mill uses this distinction is to argue that, look, unrational folks or non-human animals, whether that be swine or something else, these sort of creatures can only experience the lower carnal pleasures. They can't experience the higher forms of pleasure insofar as they lack a capacity for the higher forms of pleasure, things like literature, philosophy, and so forth. And so Mill thinks that if you can experience both things, both forms of pleasure, another way of saying that is if you have a capacity for reason and rationality, then that means that you would prefer the higher forms of pleasure over the lower forms of pleasure. And so it's really this distinction between these two different forms of pleasure that allows Mill to get out of this particular objection. So let's think about the argument then that Mill offers. The argument is pretty straightforward. Mill thinks that higher pleasures are superior both in quality and in quantity to the lower pleasures, right? The lower pleasures like food or sex or whatever else, these things have a short duration, right? So every time you eat, you're going to digest your food and you're going to need to eat again in order to have that experience, that pleasure again. So the duration is going to be shorter and the quality is going to be worse too, right? So when you eat, that may give you some small pleasure, but it's not going to be a quality of pleasure compared to something like, literature or going to the theater or certain art forms or philosophy, right? Whereas the higher pleasures, according to Mill, have a much longer duration. So the quantity is much greater. Think about something like a really great movie that you've seen or a really great book that you've read. Mill thinks that this is going to last with you for a much longer period of time. You may watch some movie that lasts with you the rest of your whole life, or read some book that makes a huge impact on who you are as an individual, and that stays with you the rest of your life, right? So this is going to be a superior form of pleasure insofar as the quantity is much greater. Likewise, the quality is going to be much greater according to Mill, because something like watching a really, really great movie or reading a really great novel is just the feeling you get from that is far superior than the feeling you get from the lower base carnal pleasures. And so that's the basic sort of argument that Mill offers for why we should think that the higher pleasures are superior to the lower pleasures and why we would prefer the higher pleasures. But this leaves open a really important question about how we can actually know the difference between the two, right? How can we know whether something is a higher form of pleasure or a lower form of a lower pleasure? For Mill, the test to know whether something is a higher or lower pleasure is based upon whether or not, right? If some person, let's call them Smith, if Smith has the capacity for both higher pleasures and lower pleasures, then Smith would prefer the higher pleasures. And so insofar as Smith prefers those things, then we can tell that those are higher pleasures. Versus, let's call up another person, Jones. If Jones lacks a capacity for the higher pleasures, then Jones will always go for the lower pleasures. And so that's a basic kind of intuitive way to make a distinction, to know the distinction between the higher and the lower pleasures. Yet we might think that Mill is not quite right, because just from an empirical point of view, there are plenty of people that have a capacity for the higher pleasures that actually prefer the lower pleasures. And so it's not immediately obvious that we're going to be able to use this test. Nonetheless, this is the basic sort of test that Mill offers for how we can know the difference between these two forms of pleasure. And it's in this way, then, that Mill responds to this objection, right? Mill argues that it's better to have some small quantity of a higher form of pleasure than it is to have a large amount of a lower form of pleasure. Indeed, this gives us Mill's famous statement that it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool who is satisfied. Again, we're thinking of a fool here as someone who lacks a capacity for reason. And for Mill, it's really these higher forms of pleasure that's going to introduce for us his view of autonomy and human freedom, right? Human freedom is going to be tied to the higher intellect.
One of the puzzles that might arise for a first-time reader of John Stuart Mill's treatise Utilitarianism is, given that he makes this distinction between higher and lower pleasures, why would anybody in their right mind, anybody who is experienced or perceptive, prefer lower pleasures to higher pleasures? And Mill has some good answers for this, and he considers two objections early on in chapter 2 of utilitarianism. So one objection is that we do see people, as he says, postpone a higher pleasure for a lower pleasure. They go for the lower pleasure, which is, right there in front of them, and then that means that they have to put off engaging in a higher pleasure. What might be an example of this? I'm set up to read some John Stuart Mill, which should be an intellectual activity, should be quite pleasurable because he's actually a good writer, not like his predecessor Jeremy Bentham, who's very dry to read, but Mill is quite interesting. So I'm ready to do this, and then I get, distracted by something else. I start perhaps watching a comedy show on Netflix. And it's not a particularly intellectually stimulating one. It's just kind of a goofy one. And I get sucked into this thing where I watch show after show after show until I fall asleep and the book never gets opened up. Now, why does that sort of thing happen? Well, Mill has an explanation for this. He says that, here we go. Many who are capable of the higher pleasures occasionally, under the influence of temptation, postpone them to the lower, but this is quite compatible with a full appreciation of an intrinsic superiority of the higher. Men often, from infirmity of character, make their election for the nearer good, whatever is easier to acquire, whatever is closer in time. Reading a book, right, you have to get into it, and it takes a bit of time to figure out what's being said. So he says they know that this is less valuable, and this no less when the choice is between two bodily pleasures than when it is between bodily and mental. So they pursue sensual indulgences to the injury of health, though perfectly aware that health is the greater good. People do this in terms of bodily pleasures. Why can't they do it in terms of bodily and mental pleasures? It makes perfect sense. People, again, do this all of the time. Just think about, for his example, how many people sign up for gym memberships that they will never actually use beyond, say, the first week. Right? This is how gyms make their money. They know this dynamic. Similarly, we may find that people say that they're going to do something that is intellectually stimulating or morally valuable or aesthetically pleasing as opposed to merely sensibly pleasing, and then they go for the sensual pleasures. That happens. The other objection is in some respects more interesting. He says, what about younger people who early on in their life, they have in fact been introduced to the higher pleasures, and they do pursue them, the pleasures of the mind, the pleasures of the human heart, you might say. And then as time goes on, as they get older, something changes. They shift. they're no longer interested in those, and they focus on the sensual pleasures. So he says, this can be understood just as well. He says, I don't believe that those who undergo this very common change, he's saying that it is common, voluntarily choose the lower description of pleasures in preference to the higher. So what's really going on there? He tells us, I believe that before they devote themselves exclusively to the one, they've already become incapable of the other. He says, capacity for the noble feelings is in most natures a very tender plant, easily killed, not just by hostile influences, things coming in from the outside, but from mere want of sustenance. And in the majority of young persons, it speedily dies away if the occupations to which their position in life has devoted them and the society in which it has thrown them are not favorable to keeping that in exercise. So although we may start out with good experience of both the higher and the lower pleasures, unless we're actively using our mental faculties, unless we're getting the sort of stimulation that we need, and perhaps even engaging in some deliberate reflection and choices to do something with it, it's going to wither away. And in a case like that, the person shifts from the higher to the lower pleasures because they no longer appreciate the higher pleasures as higher pleasures. What is the sign of that? The very fact that they do, in fact, prefer the lower. That they tell you why, say, sitting and drinking in front of the fireplace is preferable to cracking open a book or having an intellectual conversation or going out and doing some, strenuous but rewarding activities or listening to a symphony. They'd rather just let, Netflix play on and on and on while they sit there drinking some wine or beer or cocktails or whatever, right? So, these sort of cases show us that Mill does have some explanation for how people lose or don't actuate their capacity for these higher pleasures and then end up preferring the lower. There's also another interesting issue, which is, as he sees it, a major problem with society of his time. And I think you could say that from a utilitarian perspective, it's also a major problem in our contemporary society, which is that most people do not have moral and intellectual development fostered within their life, which makes it impossible for them to appreciate the higher pleasures because they never had a shot at it in the first place. He talks about, people say, a lot of people are willing to sacrifice, pleasure or happiness. He says, 19/20ths of the population routinely have to do this because of the kind of work that they're stuck doing. So what would afford the possibility for people to not skip, not miss out on the development of their intellectual and moral faculties? Well, education would have to play a role in that, and you might say also a reorganization of society, including the economy. Interestingly, this probably applies almost as much in our own time as it did in Mill's own time in the heart of the Industrial Revolution, when many people were sinking into what later would be called the proletariat or working class. And many people were working very late hours. Children were getting drawn into the workplace rather than being afforded the possibility for education. Even if we have educational institutions, they may not be of the sort that do in fact lead to effective moral and intellectual development, in which case Mill would say, from a utilitarian perspective, what is really desirable is to rework them so that does become a possibility for everybody. So he's talking about the opportunity for human development, distinctively human development, not merely to satisfy lower pleasures, which are in fact pleasures. He's not saying they're bad at all, but to afford the possibility of higher pleasures.
Many people look back upon their childhood with a great sense of nostalgia. As we look back upon it in after years, it seems a sort of lost paradise. Schopenhauer argues that the reason for this is that in childhood and young adulthood, we are more inclined to use the intellect rather than the will. Remember that in Schopenhauer's philosophy, the intellect is opposed to the will, and that all suffering in life stems from the will. Happiness, therefore, stems from tempering the will as much as possible. From a practical point of view, for the average person, Schopenhauer advocated as his main ingredient in happiness, next to good physical health, the development of the intellect through study and scientific and philosophical pursuit, or artistic creation. In short, Schopenhauer's prescription for a happy life involves the continuous task of trying to indulge the intellect rather than the will. This is why, in hindsight, childhood seems like such a happy time. As we grow up, we are mostly concerned with learning how the world works and gaining experience. In other words, we are engaging the intellect. At the same time, we have very little wants in the world, and crucially for the cynical Schopenhauer, we don't have a lot of contact with other people. In childhood, our relations with others are limited, our wants are few. In a word, there is little stimulus for the will, and so our chief concern is the extension of our knowledge. The intellect is developed early, though it takes time to mature, and it explores the whole world of its surroundings in its constant search for nutriment. It is then that existence is in itself an ever-fresh delight, and all things sparkle with the charm of novelty. This great injection of knowledge in our formative years lays the foundation for our later worldview, so they are extremely important. In this way, the earliest years of a man's life lay the foundation of his view of the world, whether it be shallow or deep, and although this view may be extended and perfected later on, it is not materially altered. By the way, this is why Schopenhauer hated the education system of his day. In school, children are taught ideas when they should be occupied with exploring the world instead. Ideas are human constructs, and they can be wrong. Children then start life with a completely wrong set of assumptions on how the world works, and unless they are innately smart enough to see through these mistakes, they are doomed to remain stuck in this erroneous mental framework. On the other hand, if children were more or less left to their own devices and exploring the world and nature at their own pace, the intellect would properly do its job of acquiring knowledge of its surroundings. Ideas can be wrong, but direct experience of the world is never wrong. An experience is an experience. The spark of novelty renders everything with a warm glow. In fact, we are simply getting acquainted with the presentation of the will, with the world as representation. The inner workings of the world, the metaphysical foundation of existence, remain as yet mysterious to us. But since the world from the outside looks so beautiful, we assume the inside must be equally beautiful. How wrong we are. Enter puberty. Remember that the chief reason for our happiness in childhood is that we are primarily concerned with the intellect and not with the will. This dynamic is flipped on its head with the advent of puberty. The sexual impulse is awakened within us. All of a sudden we are thrust into a strange new world, the world of willing. We realize that we are not purely intellectual beings, but that we are firmly rooted in the material world through our bodies. Of course, as children we have bodies too, but the awakening of the sexual impulse makes this reality so obvious it functions as a wake-up call. Suddenly we become acquainted with this other side of the world as will. And remember that for Schopenhauer, all the suffering in the world comes from the will. This is why the adolescent tends to be a gloomy, rebellious, and sometimes even actively hater of the world. In the intellectual domain, this means that youth is for studying, not producing. Production requires mastery, and mastery requires time. Spend your younger years studying, and trust that the brilliant insights will come later, when time and experience allow you to make new and unique connections. Then write your book. Youth is the time for amassing the material for a knowledge of the world that shall be distinctive and peculiar, for an original view of life. In other words, the legacy that a man of genius leaves to his fellow men. It is, however, only in later years that he becomes master of his material.
We will be talking to Professor Bloom, who is the Brooks and Suzanne Reagan Professor of Psychology and Cognitive Science at Yale University. His research explores how children and adults understand the physical and social world, with special focus on language, morality, religion, fiction, and art. Today, he will be talking about the relationship between pleasure, suffering, and the good life.
But to the extent it has a broader scope, I really am interested in capacities that seem to be uniquely human but show up early in development. I think this tells us something really distinct about human nature compared to other creatures. So if you think about it, you think about like art and aesthetics and the idea of meaning and fulfillment. And I think you find that in no other creature, but I think you find it quite early in children. I'm interested in morality, in moral judgments, and right and wrong. And although you find these sort of perhaps in diminished forms in other primates, they show up in full flourish in kids. I'm interested in some other work in intuitions about personal identity. When does somebody become the same person? Interested in concepts and categories. Are we natural essentialists, and so on? And again, these are just questions which come up in the human context. So to the extent my work ties together, and I appreciate the question, it's an interest in what's uniquely human.
So one of the core concepts of being human is happiness. So this leads to one of the most obvious questions to ask, and one that you sort of hinted at during your talk, which is, what does happiness mean to you, and how is achieving happiness different to living a good life?
Yeah, so many of the debates in the happiness literature, our discussions, turn out to be incredibly boring over how people use the word. So some people use the word happiness very broadly to refer to basically anything people choose to do. So if I choose to eat hot curry, well, I'm doing that. That must make me happy. If I choose to jump off my balcony and kill myself, well, I wouldn't have chosen if it didn't make me happy. And then from that point of view, the claim that we do what makes us happy is trivial, since it's just true by definition. And that's why it's kind of it's an uninteresting definition. But I think it's useful to make certain distinctions, and it captures various parts of psychology to make distinctions. I would distinguish happiness from pleasure, where pleasure is a sort of short-term feeling, like a sip of wine could be very pleasurable, while I think happiness is more long-term. I can ask you, Raymond, how happy your life is, how happy it's been over the last year. You can answer in an intelligent, consistent way. And you're not talking about any specific experience. You're just saying what your mood has been like, what your phenomenological state has been like. And then I could also distinguish both of them from meaning and fulfillment. So I think we find it perfectly coherent to say, well, I decided to adopt some kids and to adopt some foster kids. And this is going to take away from a lot of the fun of my life and maybe become less happy. But I think it's a very fulfilling and important thing to do. There's no contradiction to that. There's no contradiction to somebody saying, I'm going to undergo torture so as not to reveal the secrets of my organization. And for somebody to say, oh, well, you're doing that because it makes you happy. It seems ridiculous. The person says, no, this isn't making me happy. You're torturing me. It's terrible. I'm doing it because there's a larger motivation above and beyond happiness. So I would make those distinctions. In the end, you kind of want to make clear when you're arguing with somebody whether they're using the words the same way, because a lot of debates are sterile in that way. But what I would say as an empirical claim, which could be false, is that happiness, pleasure, and meaning all respond to different forces and different motivations. So, for instance, there's studies by country by country, and in the country by country studies, Gallup asked country, they've done this for like 100 years, probably 50 years. How happy is your average resident? So it turns out that people who live in affluent countries are really happy. People say, I'm happy. It correlates very well with GDP. More rich the country, the more happy. But then there was a poll then, I think like 10 years ago, where they added a different question. How much meaning does your life have? To what extent is it full of meaning? And there the results are different. It negatively correlates with how rich the country is. That is, the poorer countries had people who said their life had more meaning than richer countries. And I'm bringing this up not to make a specific point, but just to say one way to realize you're dealing with two different things is if you can make them go in two different directions.
On the note of empirical evidence, you've sort of hinted at this in your talk. What's the experimental evidence that shows that suffering could maybe lead to greater pleasure and potentially a better life. Why is this the case?
So it's a good question. You know, I see no silver bullet study that can say, let me tell you about the study that this will show it. And in some sense, it's not so much of an empirical claim as a moral claim. Suppose you're a perfect hedonist and everything, and while you know, my life involves some degree of suffering. And you say you're perfectly happy being happy. And I say, no, it's superficial, and you know, you gotta do more. There's no laboratory study that will distinguish this. However, there are some studies that do speak to this in different ways. So one set of studies, some of this work is done by a friend of mine, Brett Ford, at University of Toronto, finds that the pursuit of happiness makes people miserable. So there's several studies where they ask you, you know, how badly do you want to be happy? And how much do you pursue goals of happiness, like making money and being popular and stuff like that? And people, it turns out that the more people say this, the less happy they end up being. Now, here's a twist. This used to be in the literature, everybody said this, but they did a country by country study, and they found that in some countries, not the United States, not Canada, in some countries, people's desire to be happy did make them happy. But in these countries, they associated happiness not with money and fame, but with deeper connections to family and friends, to that sort of thing. And so this suggests that motivations that sort of seem less superficial end up having good ends.
So this actually reminds me of a Kahneman study about the peak-end effect.
Yes.
So, and it's where people, when you give people the option of choosing between like 30 minutes of just dental torture, or like 30 minutes of dental torture and 5 minutes of mild torture, they would say they prefer just 30 minutes of dental torture, but actually in reality, they would experience less suffering with the additional mild torture as well. Do you think this would constitute sort of like evidence for your claim?
It's a good question. Everybody agrees on the findings. Nobody knows what to make of it. So just to summarize, you gave a great summary, but just to kind of pin down the exciting part. So basically, you tend to think back on an experience. When you think back on it, what do you remember? Well, what's interesting is you don't remember the whole sum of the whole experience. So, you know, a really boring 10-hour plane flight is not as bad, is not twice as bad as a really boring 5-hour plane flight. In fact, a week later, you say, oh, they both sucked, even though one was twice as bad. An amazing vacation that lasted 2 weeks, you don't remember it twice as fondly as an amazing vacation lasted 1 week. In fact, you might say, oh, I had a great vacation, a lot of fun. We are immune to duration, even though these things are twice as happy, twice as sad. What Kahneman finds is that when you think back, you remember the peak of the experience and how it ended. You know, so, and this leads to a bizarre phenomena, which is you're doing like 30 minutes of extremely painful dental surgery. And then it's very painful, and then it stops, and then you leave. How you will remember it? Well, it ended horribly. You'll end it horribly. That the claim is, and there's evidence for this that he gets, that that if you said to the dentist, you know, could you top me off with 5 minutes of mild pain? And he said, really? Yeah, just hurt me, but not, it hurt me a bit. Because then you'll remember it, and you'll remember back. Say, oh, that wasn't that bad, because you remember the ending, which was mild. You know, it's like I don't know. You beat me up, and I say, oh, this is horrible. Can you give me a mild kick so I don't remember it so bad? It's insane from a hedonistic point of view. And so Kahneman, we talked about distinctions. Kahneman cleaves apart experienced happiness, which is just your experience that's coming into you. In which case, 2 weeks is twice as more than 1 week. 10 hours is twice as much as 5 hours, versus remembered happiness. And so when we're living a life of experienced happiness, you know, I'm enjoying this conversation. The longer it gets, the more pleasure I get from it, because it's just adding up like the heat-ons in my head. But a week from now, thinking back, it won't matter how long it was. Just good conversation. And so now you differ. So someone like Dan Gilbert, who's a friend of mine, a heavy-duty hedonist, says, just maximize your pleasure, dude. While Kahneman himself says, no, you try to curate a life that when you look back on it will give you pleasure. And that's closer to what I'm talking about meaning. And people do that. Sometimes people engage in experiences which they kind of know they won't like, but it's like they're building up their personal CV. And so they look back and say, oh man, yeah, I did that long hike. You know, I wrestle a monkey in this country or whatever. And it sucked when I was doing it, but man, I'm the kind of person who does it. But having said that, I think there is good and substantive work. So just to pick out some positive examples, Danny Kahneman's work on remembered happiness and experienced happiness. I mean, he didn't win the Nobel Prize for nothing. That's like really interesting and really important work. Everything that Dan Gilbert touches is interesting and creative and important. A lot of the cross-cultural, cross-society happiness, robust. People like just Elizabeth Dunn has done some lovely work finding that we get more happiness if we use our money to help others than keep it for ourselves. And there's some really robust and serious studies. So there's some very, very good work in there. Work that's been replicated, work that's been extended. But I do think that so positive psychology, just due to its very nature, has a higher proportion of crap